This video we're just going to have a look at fiscal policy and the national debt and issues around expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. These are items that they get mentioned in the specification 4.2. So if you want to pause the video there now and read those two learning outcomes to yourself, that's kind of what I'm focusing on here for the next few minutes. Okay, so this one is from the NTMA. Now, before I proceed, if you go to different places, you'll get different figures for the national debt. So the NTMA have this figure here. If you go to CSO, they'll have a slightly different figure. If you go to Department of Finance, they'll have a different one. So different ways of looking at it. So so this is what they call gross national debt. At the end of February, just a month ago, 243 billion. So if the students know that our national debt is close to 245 billion, then that would be good. Again, the common mistake is to say million instead of billion, so just to watch that. Okay, this one here, it's another one I got there off the another infographic there, or another chart from the NTMA website. So they call this general government debt, is the name they call this, and it gives you the figures back over the Celtic Tiger period. So look in the up to the present day and into the future, 2025. So you have the Celtic Tiger. I just write CT here. You have Celtic Tiger period here. We weren't borrowing very much. And then you have the financial crash in 2008 and major recession, huge drop in government current income, government running huge current budget deficits. The government was running current budget deficits from around all these years here, so it had to borrow all the way up until, where am I gone? Up until 2018. So I'll do a smiley face here. It wasn't until 2018 that we eliminated current budget deficits. So for all these years here, we had austerity. What we mean by austerity is where government basically decreased government spending and increased government current revenue. So cuts to government spending and increase in taxes. So I'll talk about them again. I can mention a few of them now. So here's a few that came in 2011. Universal social charge came in as a temporary tax. 2013 property tax came in. They tried to bring in water charges. Okay. Then on the cut in government spending side during the Great Recession, they cut public sector pay. They introduced a new pay scale for public sectors workers recruited after 2011. They closed 100 Garda stations. They closed Roscommon A&E. Public sector workers who left, retired or quit weren't replaced. There was a recruitment ban. So it was a miserable enough time. So anyways, but there was, even with all that austerity, there was still huge current budget deficits, and they weren't eliminated until 2018. So that's why borrowing rose so much there in that period. Okay. We also had to bail out the banks during that period. That cost us 64 billion euro at the time, which we didn't have lying around. A lot of that had to be borrowed. We got some of that 64 billion back by selling Bank of AIB shares, for example, and we get more of it back in the future by selling more AIB shares. But at the time, 64 billion, a lot of that ended up coming from the Troika. Just to note as well, I've circled 2011, 2012 and 2013. They're the 3 years when the Troika ran the country. That's the IMF, ECB and European Commission. And there was the bailout funds that the government were given then at that time. Okay, I'll keep going here. Here's another interesting graph here. The interest on the national debt is huge. So you can see here the interest, the amount we paid. Well, I suppose as the debt went up, as we borrowed more, we had to pay more interest on it. I always teach the students opportunity cost when I'm doing the interest. So the one I suppose the most interested in for the exam is the 2022 figure. Now you could tell them 3.89 billion euro. Now again, it depends where you look, but 3.89 billion. Go with that maybe as the interest on the national debt in 2022, in the year we're in. And then it's an opportunity to explain opportunity cost to the students. What would you get for 3.89 billion? Well, one thing you could do is, that's the same amount that we'll pay, the government will collect in universal social charge in 2022. So you could cancel universal social charge if we didn't have to pay this interest on the national debt. You could build 2 children's hospitals with the 3.89 billion. That's another thing the government could do with that money. Okay, 3.89 billion. That, I'll tell you, that represents almost 8 years worth of property tax. Almost 8 years worth of property tax just to pay the interest on the national debt next year. So it's a bit depressing. You wouldn't want to overthink this stuff. Where am I getting the 3.89 billion? I'm getting that from whereyourmoneygoes.gov.ie. If you go, I really like this website. Very useful when you're doing fiscal policy. And the first thing you'll see on that website when you go to it is this bar chart here. And then when you click on this purple one here, if you click into the 13.92 billion, that's for debt servicing and EU payments. And when you click on that, it'll bring you to this. And that's when I get the 3.89 billion. The servicing of the national debt in 2022 is expected, so you're using the Hampshire auction up here, so it's the future tense, it's expected to be 3.89 billion. Another interesting figure there is our contribution to the EU budget, our membership fee of the EU, I suppose. It'll be 3.5 billion. Just another side note there, maybe something that's worth knowing by the students. Okay. Went to the Department of Finance website. They've good data there on debt. In February 2022, just gone a month ago, according to the Department of Finance, the debt is €47,250 per person per capita. That's how much money the government owes. So it's a significant sum. Another interesting statistic in relation to debt, we borrowed €33 billion to pay for the pandemic. So €33 billion for the pandemic. That's how much we borrowed. Another interesting one I saw there on the Department of Finance website is the interest on the debt. Now obviously they take out different bonds at different bond yields and all this, but they're a current effective interest rate of 1.5%. Now I'm guessing when you take 3.89 billion in interest and you put that over 243.5 or whatever it was a few minutes ago, multiply by 100 over 1, you get a figure close to 1.5%. So but obviously different bonds would have different bond yields, so it's not that, but I suppose it's the average interest rate is the way of looking at it. And if you go back to 2012, when the Troika were running the country in 2012, if we were to borrow money, which we couldn't do at the time anyways, it would have been it would have been borrowed at 4.5%. So I suppose the fact that our interest rate has come down means that we're seen as a low risk country to lend to. Okay. This question came up in 2015 on the old course, and I'm particularly interested not maybe in 3A but 3B. So the NTMA sells bonds worth 4 billion at a low yield in 2015. It is selling bonds at a low yield, good or bad for the government. So I think it's important for the students to know the language around borrowing. So I'll very quickly do that now. Okay, so a nice way to do this with the students is with a diagram. So you have a rich person here with a suitcase full of money. So the students often wonder who is lending the money to the government. So investors, pension funds, people with money, and they could put that money in the bank or they could lend it to a government. It's just another way of saving money in a way. So they could put it in the bank, but the interest rates are terrible. So one thing they could do is they could lend it to the government, and in relation to Ireland they'd be lending it to the NTMA. So the language of debt, it's the students find it difficult, so I spend a bit of time on this diagram. So it's kind of like, so here we go. So this is the bond, this is the lender over here, and he or she is lending money to the NTMA, and the NTMA are going to give this person a receipt or an IOU or a piece of paper. So let's say it's €1 billion. Well, the receipt will say I owe you €1 billion plus interest. Now this receipt, this piece of paper is called the bond, and it's given to the lender, the rich person who lent all the money. So the lender is the bond holder. He or she has the receipt. Okay. Some other stuff around the language of debt. Think about this: when you walk into a shop and you hand over money, are you buying or selling? And the answer is you're buying. So the lender is handing over money. So he or she is buying. Buying what? Buying this bond, buying a piece of paper, buying a bond. And the government are like the shopkeeper. What does the shopkeeper do? The shopkeeper, are they buying or are they selling? The shopkeeper is selling. So in the same way, the government is selling a bond. Let's write that over here. The government is selling a bond. Okay, and the government want the interest rate to be as low as possible. and the lender wants the interest rate to be as high as possible to make as much money as possible. So there's some of the language around debt. So no harm doing that with the students. Will it come up in the exam? Well, I don't know. In the new course, we won't know for a few years till we've a couple of years worth of exam papers. But back to the exam question again. Just bear with me while I fix this. I can't fix it. Okay, I'll just move it down. Is selling bonds at a low yield good or bad for the government? So the answer is selling bonds, which means borrowing money at a low yield or at a low interest rate, is good for the government, and the lower the better. Okay, that's that. Limitations on fiscal policy. If you go back to the specification there, you can look at it yourself. So obviously there's a big definition of fiscal policy you'll be doing with the students. I often summarise it as a G&T, government spending and taxation. So adjusting government spending and taxation, in particular direct taxation, to achieve economic objectives. So there are limitations on what a government can do with its fiscal policy. So there's an EU rule around current budget deficits. So EU member states aren't supposed to have a current budget deficit that's greater than 3% of GDP. So that's a limitation on how much money the government can borrow or how big a deficit it can run. It's a limitation on fiscal policy. Another EU rule is public debt isn't meant to exceed 60% of GDP. So that's another limitation. Say if the government wanted to stimulate the economy by borrowing money and injecting it, well, it's limited then by how much it can borrow. Now these rules have been broken big time in recent years, especially because of COVID. So these two EU rules were relaxed for all EU member states due to the pandemic. So I presume they'll be reinforced at some stage in the near future. Okay. Another limitation on fiscal policy, well, the government would like to borrow money and inject it into the economy. It can only do so if there are people willing to lend to Ireland, if there are investors queuing up with suitcases full of money to lend to us, and if we have a good credit rating from a ratings agency, and we do. We're AAA rated, I think, by most of those rating agencies. Whereas if you look at Russia at the moment, they have a terrible credit rating at the moment. They are junk status, I think. Their bonds are junk status at the moment, so they're going to find it very hard to borrow, if anyone, at the moment. Whereas we'd find it much easier than them. Obviously, interest rates or bond yields, the lower the better. And when they go very high, like they did when the Troika had to come in and look after us, well, then the government can't really borrow if interest rates are prohibitively high. Another limitation on fiscal policy, especially if we're going borrowing money to increase government spending or to fund cuts in taxes, is are we already heavily indebted? And of course we are, and we're heading into another economic crisis now with a huge debt. It'd be nice if we were going into the next economic crisis with a small debt, because then we could borrow to protect ourselves, to insulate ourselves from the economic problems that are ultimately going to emerge in the coming years, maybe from the current crisis. So if you're already heavily indebted, it kind of limits how much more borrowing you can do. Okay. Other than borrowing, limitations on fiscal policy to control the economy in general, not just referring to borrowing, but just in general. I have two more over here. Imports, so the government might inject money into the economy, and then we all go and we buy BMWs from Germany, and we go to Lanzarote on our holidays, and we buy bananas from Spain. So that's a limitation on fiscal policy. If the government increases government spending, if we spend that money on imports, well, that leaks from the economy. So that limits the impact the fiscal policy will have. Another thing would be maybe if the government injected money into the economy, and if we start saving it and we don't spend it, well, that will limit the impact that fiscal policy would have on achieving a particular economic aim. Okay, so that's that. Well, yeah, just a little history lesson here in expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy. So this is on page 284 in the book, and this actual graph is on page 284. Here we go. So it's I think it's GDP here. So it's the Celtic Tiger years we start with over here. So here's the Celtic Tiger years, and during those years the government pursued an expansionary fiscal policy. It increased government spending and it cut taxes. Now, it did that at a time when what we actually needed was someone to kind of cool things down a bit, because the economy overheated during the Celtic Tiger years up until 2007. So what we got was expansionary fiscal policy, but what we needed was contractionary fiscal policy. Charlie McCreevy was the Minister for Finance at the time. He said he justified it. He says, when I have it, I'll spend it. So he injected money into the economy. As I said, cut taxes, increase government spending. Okay. Brian Linehan, he said about the Celtic Tiger period. He said it in the years following the crash, the economic crash of 2008. He said what happened was, in the Celtic Tiger years, he said we all partied, which was an interesting way of saying we pursued an expansionary fiscal policy when we should have been a bit more careful. Okay, so then you had the crash in 2008, financial crash over here. So what happened then was we got a contractionary fiscal policy where the government cut spending, closed Garda stations, introduced universal social charge in 2011, introduced property tax in 2013, public sector pay freeze, a new pay scale for public sector workers hired after 2011. So that went on for years. We got a contractionary fiscal policy, and if you look, the economy kind of stagnated there. What we needed at that time was a stimulus. What we needed was an expansionary fiscal policy. Okay. Then in 2013 things started to pick up a bit, and then you see here 2014 to 2015 you have that big 26% rise in GDP, and I've explained that in the video that deals with national income. So you see that there, the leprechaun economics. So I've talked about that earlier on. And then you come up to the COVID-19 pandemic, and the government borrowed, back to borrowing again, it borrowed 33 billion euro. So it's kind of interesting. For once they kind of got it right. What we needed at the time of pandemic was an expansionary fiscal policy, and that's what we got. So they finally got it right, that we needed the government injecting money into the economy at a time, I suppose, to prevent a downturn. If you think about it, the government injected 33 billion euro. If you combine that with the multiplier, right, I don't know what the multiplier is, it's hypothetical anyways, but let's pretend the multiplier was 2. That means that our national income is now 66 billion euro higher than it would otherwise have been. So, as I said, during the pandemic we got an expansionary fiscal policy, which is what we needed at the time. So when you combine the 33 billion the government borrowed with the multiplier, that kind of kept the lights on, and it meant we didn't go into a deep recession. It offset a deep recession. Okay, that's that. There's the business cycle. I won't focus on that now. So back to fiscal policy. I hope I've covered a couple of those things there. Measures the government can take to manage a budget deficit. Well, I talked about pay cuts, USE, introducing new taxes like property tax. I talked about, expansionary and contractionary fiscal policy there, and how the government could use these to stabilise the business cycle. Well, that's kind of what I've done just here, showing how the government stabilised the business cycle up here in the COVID-19 pandemic time in particular. What else? Limitations of fiscal policy. So the government might want to pursue an expansionary fiscal policy, but there's limitations on borrowing, and there's limitations, as I said. You might inject money into the economy and we all buy imports, go on holidays abroad. Well, then that's a limitation, so I dealt with that. How being a member of the EU limits our fiscal policy, so I've touched on that there as well. I didn't deal with the last one, so touched on some of the stuff that's in there. So I hope you found that useful. Okay, thank you.